Chapter 792. In the fine ripples, groups of Vulcan ants emerged one after another, and they were annihilated again and again. There were at least a few dozen groups of thousands of them, and only one or two lucky ones like the evidence Gongqi had captured before, escaped the interference zone of the domain fragments and the fine ripples of spacetime. They came out in one piece, but in the blink of an eye, they were swept away by the howling sandstorm and crushed in another form. Their actions were like moths flying into a flame. He had no idea what was going on. Gongqi observed carefully, forcing himself to calm down. It took a great deal of willpower for him to hold back from rushing over at the first moment. But his mind kept turning. If even ants can pass through the interference point, there's no reason I can't pass through it. Alright, I need to calm down. Maybe it's just a tiny point. I need to widen it. What's on the other end of the interference point? He needed to investigate further. Actually, he could guess it. It was most likely a magma space. In recent years, research on Vulcan ants had been a very popular field. This kind of social aberrant population, aberrant nests that could be cultivated, and the mental level that could be raised through collective consciousness. There were too many things to ponder. Gongqi searched his memory for relevant research papers, hoping to find more clues and verification from the habits of Vulcan ants. The problem was that no research had ever mentioned that Vulcan ants could actually penetrate the space-time barrier, reach a shattered space and come in waves to die. For an aberrant population with strict social ethics, what was the meaning of such behavior? Most importantly, would it affect Gongqi, who was in a hurry to return to Earth's spacetime? Just as he was pondering, the position of the spacetime interference point finally changed a little after thousands of Vulcan ants were annihilated. The source of the change was the remains of the Vulcan ants' shells. In terms of size, the Vulcan ant was considered rather large among the ant species. The different variants produced by each nest had an average length of 1.2 centimeters. The largest was even nearly 5 centimeters in size. But from a human's perspective, it was still not considered much, not to mention compared to the vast and boundless misty maze. However, when thousands of similar gadgets surged out in a short period of time and piled up the corpses, the adjectives such as tiny were no longer suitable. Although their bodies could not resist the erosion of the sandstorm, they turned the unfavorable situation bit by bit in an even more incredible way. When the crushed remains were piled up to a certain extent, Gongqi actually felt a very obvious magic. Due to the piling up of these corpses, the fine ripples in the void became somewhat chaotic. However, the indistinct spacetime gap of the interference point was not affected. Instead, it expanded and stabilized. These fire god ants seemed to be using their own corpses to fill the trench. Their tiny shells carried amazing energy. Even if they were shattered, the energy would still remain. Also, under the effective effect of the group consciousness, they were reassembled and built a bridgehead on the interference point of space and time. Although it was not yet completed, the prototype could already be seen. As long as there were no more major disturbances in the misty labyrinth, and the fire god ant colony had an endless supply of backup forces, it would most likely be completed. The mutant species were indeed peculiar and extraordinary. The material attributes of the individual and the mental level of the group were extremely efficient in integrating together. This was how they achieved such an astonishing result. This group of first-hand materials that could drive a mutant ecologist crazy was a small matter. What was truly decisive was the endlessly expanding and stabilizing narrow passageway that clearly connected Earth's spacetime with the misty labyrinth. Whether it was calculations or senses, they all verified the authenticity of the passageway. The heavens have not forsaken me. Gongqi really could not hold it in any longer. The path of survival was within reach, but it had already consumed most of his mental strength. The bridgehead formed by piling up the corpses of the fire god ants was becoming more and more obvious. Its defense and interference rules were becoming more and more unyielding. While it was helping him resolve his problems, he could not help but worry. If this continued, it was hard to say what sort of situation the fire god ant colony would stir up. In the off chance it affected the spacetime structure of the interference point, it would result in the consequence of making a mistake of 1,000 miles. He could only ram his head into a wall. The fire god ant's strange and illogical behavior and the natural space of lava on the other side were completely unrelated to humans no matter how he looked at it. It had nothing to do with Luonan, who he feared the most. All he needed to do now was to return to Earth's spacetime and bypass the threats of Ouyang Qin and Wu Jiong. The sky was high and the sea was wide. Nothing could stop him. Go go go. When Gong Qi's mind was set, the yarn of silence displayed its miraculous effect. Gong Qi's spiritual body truly seemed to become a thin mist of nothingness under the wrapping of this strange item. His powerful, extraordinary level power was hidden in formlessness. He was able to go against the flow of the narrow passageway constructed by the fire god ants. He intersected with the fire god ant colony that surged out, and he also made close contact with their group consciousness. He brushed past them. He was truly close to the fire god ant colony, and his senses were even more exquisite. This group of little things, whether they were alive or dead, did indeed have their own rules. The mental power formed by the group consciousness was both a commander and a glue. It dominated the entirety of the colony and each individual from life to death. If he were to substitute himself as an individual in this society, then it would truly be so tight that it would suffocate him. But if he were to observe it from a detached perspective, there was no lack of errors and omissions formed by low-level instincts. And this was the most natural state. It was precisely because of this that Gong Qi eliminated the risk and came over with peace of mind. However, he also carefully avoided disturbing them, afraid that something unexpected would happen. The space-time rift was a highly distorted structure. It was very difficult to quantify it with something like length. Gong Qi had to conform to the rules and regulations of the fire god ants, which took a lot of time. But when he truly moved out, he still deeply felt that all the hard work was worth it. The chaotic misty maze and the monotonous cloud world were completely left behind. What replaced them were more diverse and orderly structures and colors. In the hollow underground cavern, dark red lava gurgled, illuminating the surrounding cavern walls. It also illuminated the huge ant nest that was half trapped inside. Dark black and dark red were the main colors, mixed with the bluish-gray pieces of the rock. The state of interweaving light and shadow was filled with natural liveliness and charm. I'm back, I'm back. Gong Qi burst into laughter. His laughter surged in the underground lava area, stirring up waves. At this time he was no longer afraid of anything. Even if there was a mutated nest next to him, it did not matter. Perhaps it was because of Gong Qi's impudence that in the fire god ant nest a dozen meters away, the billions of fire god ants that were working hard became restless. These movements and reactions were quickly reflected in their group consciousness. Restlessness and hostility were like sparks and oil colliding, igniting at the slightest touch. Hee, these little things. Gong Qi did not mind being like many research teams at all, coming to the center and bringing out the queen of the fire god ant colony as a captive to conduct in-depth research. From their behavior just now, they really had a lot of research value. But in the next second, his gaze turned to the fire god ant nest. He suddenly felt that something was wrong. Why did the style of this nest look so familiar? Also, the group consciousness of the fire god ants that had already ignited did not rush up to kill like the low-level creatures. Instead, it was accumulating and circulating the heat. In a breath's time, its influence and interference pattern had already exceeded the range of Gong Qi's judgment. It spread rapidly to a wider area, almost like a prairie fire. Boom, boom, boom. The lava beneath him stirred. Sparks from the group consciousness of the fire god ants splashed. The already burning fluid seemed to have peeled off a layer of old skin. The dark red layer of light on the surface, under the effect of the explosively rising heat, split into pieces. What replaced it was an even brighter and more dazzling yellow-white light. The entire underground cavern was illuminated as bright as day by the sudden burst of light. It was so bright that Gong Qi's spirit body was penetrated by the light and became a lot fainter. Gong Qi looked at all of this in a daze. He watched as the temperature of the lava rose abnormally. Very quickly, it exceeded the normal upper limit of the natural world. From 800 to 900 degrees, it shot up to 3,000 to 4,000 degrees. And the huge pressure that created all of this sank from the mental plane to the physical plane. Very quickly it surged back up, forming a wonderful two-way cycle. And pressure and temperature, mental and physical, were perfectly unified, forming a stable and solid closed loop. This series of changes originated from the effect of the fire god ants group consciousness. But in the process of this effect, there was clearly an even stronger core. Gong Qi finally reacted. He locked onto his vision and senses, staring at the huge ant nest in the turbulent lava space that connected the top and bottom of the cavern. Under the effect of high temperature and high pressure, parts of the ant nest structure could not withstand it and fell off. However, it wrapped around the base of the coarse stone pillars. Even if it stood in the hottest lava, it did not change shape or shake at all. Furthermore, it was absorbing the high-temperature fluid that was close to being in a gaseous and liquid state, causing it to flow through the structure of the ant nest. It became a circulating bloodline. The energy and chi activity thus linked up and continued to operate and upgrade. The ant nest was like a mountain and the lava was like water. Yet this landscape was as malevolent as hell. It integrated the group consciousness of billions of fire god ants and gave it an even more warped and restless quality. More importantly, there was a higher level of power here. Blood, blood, blood. Fire, fire, fire. Gong Qi's expression changed. Blood flame order, do you have a death wish? Although that was what he said, under the extreme environment of high temperature and high pressure, the fanatical and devout power of faith was like a prairie fire. It filled all the space of consciousness that Gong Qi could sense. It possessed direct lethality, but it also contained a deep and violent venom. It burned, eroded, and entangled without care. Even Gong Qi had to fend it off in a fluster for a moment. At this moment, an ethereal voice of laughter came through the air. Chapter 793. It was a woman's voice, but this wasn't the main point. It was somewhat familiar, but it didn't matter. What truly tormented him was the information contained within the laughter. Especially when the words Mr. Luo came out. The 10 or so words that naturally extended behind it transformed into sharp knives. They sliced back and forth in his heart, forcefully carving out a face. Luonan. The young face transformed from the human face relief was carved into his heart. It gazed coldly at him, seemingly mocking this old man who refused to accept reality. Gong Qi's mind was in chaos at this moment. It could not be cut off, it could not be extinguished. The piercing words were admittedly a primer. The more practical reason was that this lava cavern had already transformed into a domain controlled by the laws of the Blood Soul Temple. It originated from the extreme melancholy and despairing power of the battlefield. It possessed a powerful ability to infect and assimilate. The Vulcan ant nest was vaguely the structure of the Blood Soul Temple. Gong Qi still vaguely remembered the relevant information. The physical structure of the Blood Soul Temple was something that the Blood Flame Order had not been able to accomplish even at its peak, let alone after it had split apart. Now that it had taken form, it had become a preset battlefield. It had been set up as a trap, and it had been set up specifically for him. It was simply shameful. Everyone else would suffer interference and suppression within this domain, but the Blood Flame Order could obtain an inexhaustible amount of power from within. And there was only one woman who could control this domain in the main and branches of the Blood Flame Order. Gong Qi forcefully suppressed the fluctuations in his heart and shifted his gaze. Diagonally below him, in the boiling lava surrounding the fire god ant nest, a slender woman was slowly rising up. She was not wearing a single piece of clothing. There were no clothes in this world that could preserve such a high temperature that could melt gold and iron. The same was true for a normal human body. But this woman had indeed risen up from the lava. She had a calm demeanor. Mrs. Halder. Gong Qi's mind went berserk when he saw this scene. He spoke coldly after half a second had passed. Since when did the Blood Flame Order become a lapdog under the feet of a little doll? The only response he received was a strange smile. When Mrs. Halder lifted the corner of her lips, a fiery red light shot out from her facial features and even her delicate and thin skin. It was as if she was engulfed by raging flames from the inside out. She was about to turn into ashes in the next moment. But in reality she wasn't. The red light gushing out from her body was actually a sign of the high temperature and high pressure, as well as the complete mixing of blood essence and vitality. In Gong Qi's eyes, this was undoubtedly the interference control level of an extraordinary. Oh, not control. Gong Qi's eyes were very sharp. He quickly discovered that Lady Halder didn't put any effort into balancing the internal and external forces at all. This woman had chosen to be a great Satan, allowing the structure of the Blood Soul Temple to naturally suppress the situation. Her thoughts were purified and condensed, forming a sharp light that swam through the destructive heat, messing with the fragile balance at will. Are you crazy? You are under the control of others? Why would you risk your life for Luonan? Now, Gongqi seriously needed an explanation to understand the core logic behind this series of unforeseen events. But what he had been waiting for was Lady Halder smiling and pouncing at him. The lava cavern glowed brightly with red light, and the temperature inside had clearly risen again. The high temperature and high pressure environment did not cause much harm to Gongqi's spirit body, but under the manipulation of the Blood Soul Temple's domain, the storm formed by the reverse interference abyssal region still posed a considerable threat. Lady Halder was the first ablatum of the Blood Flame Order. Although her strength had yet to reach the extraordinary level, she had the support of the Blood Soul Temple's configuration in the abyssal region. She could not be underestimated. On the other hand, Gongqi's fleshly body had been damaged, and his foundation in the abyssal region had collapsed. He had no choice but to be careful. What the hell was going on? Gongqi was guarding against the storm stirred up by the abyssal region, but what Lady Halder was pointing at was merely her mental strength. This mental strength, which was hard to distinguish between real and fake, had clearly gone through inconceivable tempering. It had condensed into an unparalleled edge, and it chopped down without regard for anything. Gongqi's defensive mode and offensive direction were completely different. Gongqi's spirit body was nearly pierced through by the sharp edge. Even though he dodged quickly, the structure of his spirit body seemed to have been scorched by raging flames. There were faint signs of warping and floating. This was the heart incineration blade. Gongqi quickly grasped the core of Lady Halder's secret offensive technique, and his mind became a bit chaotic. He clearly knew that this secret technique had been publicized to the world long ago, and that many B-rank powers were cultivating it, but he still immediately associated it with Wu Jiang, Luonan and Lady Halder. It wouldn't be strange if there was another person behind them. At this time, Lady Halder chopped down once more. She really did treat herself as a fleshly body, and she was burning her blood and energy. Her fleshly body was on the brink of life and death. She attacked in a direct manner without holding back at all. Scram! Gongqi's emotions exploded. The green-gray essence energy that was intertwined with his life and energy swept down from the outer layer of his spirit body. It connected with Lady Halder's mental strength. This attack truly held nothing back. It was like 10,000 years of frigid ice in the polar regions. It forcefully froze the heart incineration blade and seized the opportunity to pierce through. It wanted to break Lady Halder's fragile balance and end the battle quickly. The red light was a bit chaotic, and the green-gray energy charged back, polluting the originally transparent domain of the Blood Soul Temple. It even seeped into Lady Halder's body. Lady Halder's body froze, and the old scar on her cheek seemed to tear open once more. The flames were like vipers as they slithered across her cheek. It was like a second flame had been lit. After a brief moment of chaos, the penetrating red light erupted once more. It forcefully expelled the corrosive power of Gongqi's essence energy, and it charged forth once more. The green-gray essence energy and the sharp edge instantly intersected and separated. In the blink of an eye, they coiled around each other and collided. In the time it took for an ordinary person to take a breath, the two had exchanged over 30 blows. Later on, the high-frequency vibrations formed by the collision nearly tore apart the domain of the Blood Soul Temple's structure. A small portion of the lava cavern had already collapsed, and this was only the result of the attack on the mental plane interfering with the material plane. Suddenly there was a long hiss. Lady Halder's body was struck solid by the enormous force. Her entire body was like a fiery meteor as she smashed heavily into the high-temperature lava. She was less than half a meter away from the physical structure of the Blood Soul Temple. The fiery glow of the lava instantly engulfed over half of this structure, and quite a few fragments were smashed down. However, the main body remained majestic and unmoving. What a pity! Gongqi cried to himself. The most direct method was to break the domain of the Blood Soul Temple and destroy its foundation on the material plane. However, Lady Halder was quite strange. She was still able to forcefully control herself even in such a passive situation. Her momentum was thwarted, but she did not fall into chaos. Of course, even if she had the support of the Blood Soul Temple's domain, she would certainly pay a price for clashing with an extraordinary at the level of an architect. Gongqi could see that Lady Halder's body had truly ignited with flames. The flesh of her chest, abdomen, and limbs were charred black, and the outline of her body had shrunk in an extremely bizarre manner. Burning essence energy and burning flesh. How ruthless! Gong Qi felt his heart burn as he watched Lady Halder's aura rise and fall. The one before him was Lady Halder, but he was thinking about something else in his heart. Just what version of the bewitching curse did Luonan use to make the head of a religion risk her life to fight? If things were to continue like this, then even if he broke through the domain of the Blood Soul Temple, his losses would far exceed his estimations. Chapter 794. Gong Qi had a certain realization. He was within the domain of the Blood Soul Temple. The operation of the opponent's power and the corresponding rules had already formed a closed loop. He was fighting in the domain of an enemy extraordinary. This was a strategic defeat. The basic starting conditions were already very difficult to change or reverse. Under these circumstances, while enduring the corresponding pressure, he had to plan a corresponding counterattack. He had to start from the tactical details and do his best to seize back the initiative. Taking the initiative was not the same as charging in and attacking. On the contrary, Gong Qi's attitude was more conservative. The greatest benefit of a conservative attitude was that he could maintain a cool head, restrain his consumption, and do his best to precisely allocate resources in order to deal with the possible changes in the future. In theory, this should be the case. However, Gong Qi felt that this wasn't the case after a round of confrontation. On the contrary, the consumption was clearly lower than what he had predicted. The greatest possibility was that the high temperature and high pressure of the domain of the Blood Soul Temple and the corresponding law environment could form an even stronger suppression on him, creating an even greater consumption. Moreover, this was the case. Gong Qi didn't take advantage of the situation to pursue and attack. He stared at Lady Halder, observing the changes in her state. The strength of the opponent's blood and energy was declining, but her internal cohesion and sharpness didn't decrease. Oh, her blood and energy were replenished from the domain of the Blood Soul Temple. Was she planning on fighting a protracted battle? No, that wasn't right. This woman's motives weren't simple at all on the mental level. Gong Qi spoke half-mockingly and half-probingly. The body and mind are like blades, the domain is like a furnace, and I'm here to stir up the wind and hammer. Not a bad idea. You want me to coordinate with you? It's not up to you. Gong Qi was stupefied again. He didn't know what kind of attitude he should take. Lady Halder was smiling at this time. She completely disregarded her own burning flesh and her damaged state. She pounced forward once more. She didn't control the domain of the Blood Soul Temple and instead engaged in a killing style. This sort of unsettled ambition. Did she look down on the first ablatum of her order? It was truly absurd to the point where one couldn't laugh. Gong Qi didn't care about the future of the Blood Flame Order. But why did he have to encounter such an expert who didn't care about fame and position, who didn't even care about life? For a time, Gong Qi was a bit annoyed from being pestered, but his train of thought was still clear. Luonan had set up an ambush for him here, so Luonan most likely had a backup plan. After all, Mrs. Halder was barely qualified to be used as a sniper, but she wasn't quite qualified to be the decisive character. It must be known that the might of the domain of the Blood Soul Temple was extraordinary. If he continued to delay here, it would be fine if that kid Luonan chased after him. But if he waited for Ouyang Qin, Wu Jiong and the like to take action, then his life would most likely end here. But then again, if the Transcendents wanted to set up an ambush, why did they have to complicate matters and have Madame Halder take the lead? This was an unnecessary move. The logic behind this was simply too confusing. Just who was behind Luonan? What kind of dirty tricks were they going to play? When is he going to use that move? Gong Qi's thoughts were intertwined and he found it hard to calm down. He was even more unwilling to tangle with Lady Halder. This woman's willpower is commendable, but strength is what matters. She wants to rely on the domain of the Blood Soul Temple to fight a protracted battle and sharpen her blade? Does she really think my extraordinary domain is just for show? With a single thought, the curtain unfurled and smoke filled the air. The thin smoke was unremarkable within the forge-like domain of the Blood Soul Temple, but the veins of laws that came from the rank of an extraordinary were real. Since Gong Qi's foundation in the Abyss district had been damaged and collapsed, he no longer had the main axis of dispatching. His originally advantageous extraordinary domain had enormous flaws, so he couldn't help but be cautious. Therefore, he didn't take the initiative to activate his domain to interfere. He just wanted to observe and examine the situation, and then take the initiative to strike later. Now was his chance. Even though Gong Qi's own structure of laws was already full of flaws, he could still easily and delightfully destroy them. Within the domain of the Blood Soul Temple, the battle circle surrounding the two was inexplicably cool. Visually, the smoke curtain was faintly discernible, but its existence truly disrupted the transmission of energy. It caused a clear difference in temperature between the inside and outside of the curtain. Of course, it was impossible to completely isolate it. But under the strangulation of the chaotic laws, Gong Qi was 100% certain that he could destroy the stability of the transmission tunnel and disrupt Madame Halder's food supply route. He could pull the rug from under her. But Madame Halder's qi and blood surged into the heavens. She revealed her sharpness and a bright light slashed through the air. Unexpectedly, she wasn't affected at all and her aura flourished even more. When it was Gong Qi's turn, his mind was in a daze. The heart-burning blade really did slash at him on the mental plane. A portion of his spiritual body structure burned and evaporated. Even if he didn't lose his foundation, he was still injured. One slash, Madame Halder muttered softly. Just by looking at her smile, there was no malevolence in battle. Instead, it was like she was playing cards with her best friend during afternoon tea. Very good. Gong Qi couldn't care less about this small injury. He activated his extraordinary domain, the curtain, and retracted it. There was even a greenish-gray stream of energy circulating within it. It almost formed a dark cloud in the lava cavern, forcefully distorting the structure of the Blood Soul Temple's domain. He no longer held back in his methods. It was completely a battle between extraordinaries. Their domains would collide and suppress each other. Originally, he wanted to conserve his strength to deal with an unknown enemy, but the omen on Madame Halder's side wasn't good. It was rising. Gong Qi's heart twitched once more. No matter how miraculous the structure of the Blood Soul Temple's domain was, the interference and distortion of the two domains should have long since messed up the energy transmission tunnel. However, Madame Halder was clearly burning and consuming a large amount of qi and blood at every moment. Yet her recovery process was uninterrupted, undisturbed, and undiminished. Although she didn't recover all at once, the steady rhythm of the night rain rising without him realizing it formed a strong contrast with Gong Qi's unrestrained methods and his unstoppable consumption of qi and blood. There was something fishy going on. Gong Qi stared at Madame Halder and sensed his own body. Comparing the two, the fuzzy feeling gradually became clearer. It wasn't the Blood Soul Temple's domain at work. At the very least, it wasn't the main structure. It was just a cover. Madame Halder charged forward again without any fear. Every time she slashed out, she burned her qi and blood without holding back. But no matter how she tossed and turned, there would always be a return in a timely manner. No, it was an immediate injection. There was no internal or external conduction or transformation process. It was as if her body had a blood return device. However, when Gong Qi eliminated the information interference of the Blood Soul Temple's domain and compared Madame Halder's blood recovery with his own consumption, he clearly sensed a certain relationship between the ebb and flow of the fluctuations. Is she drawing my blood? No, she doesn't have the ability to do so. There's still a middle link. In other words, there might be a middle link. While drawing my blood, the extracted power is converted into universal energy, and then injected into Madame Halder's body. What a joke. Gong Qi found it hard to accept such an absurd guess. Chapter 795. After a few seconds of absent-mindedness, Gong Qi seemed to hear something. The subtle sound seemed to be hidden behind the cries and praises of the Blood Soul Temple domain. Blood, 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 fire, fire, fire. It was even more distant and even more chaotic. Gong Qi's thoughts traced upwards and the degree of chaos continued to rise. It was as if he had arrived at the center of a metropolis. There were streams of people everywhere. He closed his eyes, and he could hear the clamor of human voices echoing at all times. He was clearly spying on Yue, but on this level he was practically drowned out by the clamor of sound. Fortunately, he was rich in experience and he promptly adjusted the wrong direction of his senses. He no longer pondered and analyzed the details of the clamor of voices. Instead, he strove to capture the general characteristics of the chaos. Luonan. Even if it was Luonan, that damned young man. Just what sort of standard did he use to gather such an enormous flood of information? Actually, if one were to seriously consider it, there was a thread to follow. The domain of the Blood Soul Temple, the burning of Mrs. Halder's blood and energy, the extreme beliefs of blood and fire. There had to be some connection hidden behind these materialized things. Was it the psychic power of the believers, the call, the prayer? No, it was something even more primitive. It had yet to form concrete logic. Then it was emotion. What sort of emotion was it? It was fear. Bit by bit, Gongqi analyzed and sensed until he captured the most crucial clue. His train of thought suddenly became clear and broadened. That's right. It was fear. On the chaotic information plane, there existed the terror and panic of not knowing what to do. There was also the ruthlessness and savagery of a cornered beast. These two reactions were nearly polar, yet they were unified on the most essential core. All of this was piled up, operating and pressurized on this hidden plane. It was like a high-temperature furnace that was endlessly adding fuel. Every participant was consciously and unconsciously speeding up this process, even if this required them to pay endlessly and consume energy until they became weak and dazed. Such matters were not rare in the inner world. Gongqi used his experience to quickly determine the nature of the matter. Sacrifice. Luonan was conducting a sacrificial ritual. This sort of ritual used a so-called high-dimensional structure to exchange a low-level resource for a high-level resource. Mrs. Halder was cooperating with him. Or to be more precise, she was the one who knew and carried out this ritual. The Blood Flame Order was a secret organization that was best at utilizing extreme emotions such as fear and anger. The Blood Soul Temple was the most efficient organization in utilizing such emotions. However, according to Gongqi's previous senses, the Blood Soul Temple was not the main body. It was in a subsidiary position, perhaps only a pillar in the structure. This pillar was also burning furiously right now. It was essentially no different from those who had sacrificed their essence, blood and vitality in fear and fury. No, it should be said that it burned more fiercely and more extreme. The chi-chi sound of the airflow was not only in the material plane, but also in Gongqi's mind. Every rise and fall carried a scorching sharpness. Madame Halder's attacks seemed to have no end, and the sharpness of her attacks seemed to have no upper limit. At least until her body and vitality were completely incinerated. Gongqi forced her back again and again, slamming her against the stone walls of the cave and into the lava. He shattered her bones and imprisoned her vital energy. However, this overwhelming advantage was unable to grind away Madame Halder's most essential core. She had already abandoned everything. Only her heart shone with an extreme sharpness. This sort of situation shouldn't have appeared. Her mental willpower was as firm as diamond, but it was unable to resist the decay and collapse of her material foundation. But today Madame Halder brought out the most extreme and cruel method. She had abandoned everything, and she had used the most brilliant method to abandon everything. She had placed herself and perhaps even the entire system of the Blood Flame Order on the altar constructed by Luonan. She carried out a sacrifice in exchange for support that far exceeded the limits of her abilities. This was without a doubt a gamble. Even if Madame Halder was still alive after this battle, she would basically be half-cooked. She would spend the rest of her life on a sickbed, a life worse than death. Unless she could seize the spiritual opportunity in this battle and make a breakthrough, becoming an extraordinary. She could modify and reconstruct the structure of her body. Why was she so confident in Luonan? As it turned out, her confidence was rewarded. She abandoned everything in exchange for the limitless potential to break through all shackles. Compared to the force of impact on the material plane, Madame Halder's will was tempered to a peerless sharpness. Every time they clashed, even if her attacks were blasted into disarray, Gongqi would suffer the cuts of her sharp will. Distracting thoughts rose one after another, and it became harder and harder for his mind to harmonize. Of course, this wasn't just the effect of Madame Halder's attacks. Gongqi really didn't understand. It was fine if Madame Halder was willing to sacrifice herself, but why was he unwittingly falling into the trap as well? Was it because of the pull of the battle's energy, the mutual attacks? Oh no. As an extraordinary, the energy around Gongqi's body was a body of its own. It possessed its own rules. He was the only one who assimilated others. He shouldn't be easily drawn into another system. At least this was the case on the level of energy manipulation. But if he eliminated all of this, he would think deeper and more primitive. Using fear as the foundation for the standard of sacrifice meant that he himself fulfilled the requirements? Was he in fear? Gongqi instinctively wanted to cut off this thought, but the illusory yet real connection of energy within the domain of the Blood Soul Temple and the corresponding rational analysis told him there was no point in deceiving himself. That's right. He was afraid. In the misty labyrinth, he was afraid of Luo Nan's series of plans and the gradual realization of Luo Nan's firm execution ability. In the domain of the Blood Soul Temple, he was afraid of Madame Halder's extreme willpower to abandon everything. Even if this woman's goal wasn't pure, through the method of sacrifice, she formed a perfect fusion with Luo Nan's goal. Observing the enemy was like looking into a mirror. When the enemy's design was flawless, the flaws on his side were reflected particularly clearly. No matter how much Gong Qi denied it, he was afraid in the end. He was afraid of defeat. He was afraid of death. He was afraid of cutting off his path forward. Yet all of this was concealed under the shameful mentality of being thwarted by a junior. He consoled himself and deceived himself. There was a flaw in his heart, but he was unaware of it. This gave the other side an opportunity to take advantage of him. I have to be steady, Gong Qi shouted to himself. The light of spiritual wisdom illuminated the unbearable corner of his heart. He felt terrible, but he was far from being in a hopeless situation. Thinking about it seriously, Luo Nan tossed and turned so much one step after another. Wasn't it all for the sake of creating a flaw in Gong Qi's heart and baiting him? But Gong Qi was an extraordinary. What was it that gave Luo Nan the confidence to construct a framework to trap extraordinaries? What level of knowledge and power was that? From top to bottom, there were nearly 100 extraordinaries in the inner world. They represented the highest level of martial power on earth. Gong Qi had been Deputy Secretary General for several decades. He had gratitude and grudges, hatred and friendship with these people. He was truly able to count them like the back of his hand. Right now, he used the most rational and objective state of mind to go through the list of these people and the powers they belonged to. From the Ability User Society to the 3 Great Secret Orders. From the big shots who sat on the ground and divided the spoils, to the wandering heroes. Then the answer he obtained was none. Not a single powerful person or power that had connections to Luo Nan, who had grudges with him, who had the strength and qualifications to set up a killing trap. This was normal. Otherwise, extraordinaries wouldn't be the peak combat power of the world. Gong Qi had toiled painstakingly for several decades in the Ability User Society. There was no meaning in that. So calm down. Don't scare yourself. Gong Qi shouted to himself once more. Even though Luo Nan had constructed these structures, he really couldn't understand them. The complex and profound details hidden deep beneath the simple principles of sacrifice were still daunting to look at. But if Luo Nan really did have an overwhelming advantage, why would he need to do such complex preparatory work? This was more like a dazzling display of deterrence. It was an exquisite but limited method. He had experience in dealing with such methods. You don't have the chance. Suddenly a voice cut in. After a long time, Mrs. Halder finally took the initiative to speak to him. Her throat was roasted by the high temperature. It was hoarse and unpleasant to listen to, but it was like the final verdict. It was very ear-piercing. You are the first ablatum, yet you destroy the order for your own selfish desires. You evil woman, you dare to disturb my mind. Gong Qi's reply went straight to the root of the problem after reconstructing his mental state. It was much sharper. And the corresponding method was even more straightforward and fierce. The ashen cloud suddenly boiled and expanded as it faced Mrs. Halder's flying bloody light. It towered high like a cliff and its color darkened. It was like a cumulonimbus cloud in summer. It was bloated and enormous and its top crystallized. It forcefully resisted the high temperature of the Blood Soul Temple's domain, forming a powerful counteracting force. The hazy cloud was like a pillar that could smash the heavens. It forcefully split apart the foundation of the laws of the Blood Soul Temple's domain on the material plane. It painted this land of lava with a completely rebellious color. It also turned the most active and resolute woman into an insignificant reptile. The rumble of the collapsing airflow directly suppressed the rumbling of the boiling and exploding lava. It was as if a snowstorm had come from beyond the heavens. It crushed the rock strata who knew how deep it was, and a bone-chilling coldness descended. The forceful distortion and interference of the extraordinary domain suppressed the rules of the Blood Soul Temple's domain. The other was the all-out attack of an extraordinary. Mrs. Halder was blasted flying once more. Gong Qi's mental state had made a decision, and he had finally achieved enough pressure on the Blood Soul Temple's domain. He destroyed the relevant environment, and a portion of the force even pierced through the structure of the domain and landed on the periphery. The lava cavern began to collapse, and the passageway leading to the ant nest suffered the attack. Tens of thousands of Vulcan ants were annihilated into ashes every second. The Vulcan ant group consciousness, which was an important support for the Blood Soul Temple's domain, also suffered the attack. Gong Qi was confident that he could completely shatter the Blood Soul Temple's domain after another 2 or 3 rounds of attacks of this level. More importantly, Gong Qi gained a more detailed understanding of the environment he faced as the extraordinary domains interfered and collided with each other. First, Luo Nan's entangling net frame construction was much more ingenious than Gong Qi's second judgment. Although Luo Nan's previous attacks had already disturbed the Blood Soul Temple's domain that supported Mrs. Halder, the deeper layers of incorporeal frames and restraints still towered silently. They were simultaneously erected on the material and mental planes. They seemed incorporeal yet incorporeal. No matter how the lava surged and the storm wreaked havoc in the abyssal region, they were not affected. Was this really Luo Nan's doing? It didn't look like it. It really didn't look like it. Such a construction, such a penetrating research, such a deep thought, and such an ingenious frame faintly surpassed the level of the abyssal region. It probed towards an even higher level. According to Gong Qi's understanding, perhaps only powerful people like that old ghost Abner or the leaders of the 3 great secret orders had the qualifications to touch upon this. If this really was the case. Wasn't this going against the logic of just being smooth? Then this was some sort of result that had yet to enter the scope of the inner world's attention. Luo Nan already had the cloud world, so having such a high-end structure was nothing. As for how Luo Nan was going to support the foundation of this structure, to allow it to exist and operate, this was a difficult problem that could only be solved at the end of the matter. Compared to this difficult problem that was hard to explain, Gong Qi discovered a second point that made him relax a bit. He cast aside his fear and stretched out his mental senses after smashing the Blood Soul Temple's domain. He did not discover Luo Nan's second trump card. Aside from the sacrificial structure that was so exquisite that it was unreal, there were no other extraordinary level powers within the range of his senses. Luo Nan, this young man, really only used Lady Halder and the Blood Soul Temple's system as his final method of intercepting and killing him. Or perhaps, it was a hook to pull him into a trap. Was this an extraordinary self-confidence, or was this a compromise made out of helplessness? Or perhaps there was a dangerous enemy that possessed absolute patience, preparing an even more fatal ambush from afar? None of this was important. The structure of Gong Qi's pupils in his spirit body was infected by the greenish-gray essence energy. A thick pillar of cloud of the same color wrapped around his tyrannical laws and will. It collided with the domain of the Blood Soul Temple once more, emitting an earth-shaking rumble. A second attack without any misgivings. The entire lava cavern swayed and swayed. Flames burst forth chaotically. Gong Qi's top priority was no longer to delve into the details of the enemy's mentality. This was because the expanded mental sense network marked out a narrow but absolutely safe area for him. With this distance as a buffer, Gong Qi was confident that he could escape unscathed even if there were powerful enemies lying in ambush in the indiscernible outer region. After all, he possessed the top-notch teleportation technique in the world. As long as he destroyed the enormous source of interference that was the domain of the Blood Soul Temple, he could make the surrounding space-time environment relatively stable. Even if it was only for a short second, it would be enough for him to escape 1,000 kilometers away. Before, Luo Nan had used the Cloud World, the Mist Maze, and the domain of the Blood Soul Temple to suppress Gong Qi's ability. But now it was impossible for Luo Nan to return to these 2 damned places. The remaining source of interference that seemed troublesome could no longer be called troublesome without the most dreadful potential threat. Yes, it couldn't. The greenish-gray cumulonimbus cloud suddenly swayed for a moment. The upper layer isolated the high temperature and pressure. The cloud layer spontaneously condensed at the top. Perhaps the appearance of the cloud layer was too similar to certain meteorological conditions in the natural world. Crackling sparks of electricity flashed at the front where the low-temperature cloud layer and the high-temperature domain made close contact. Gong Qi's pupils were already immersed in greenish-gray light. They flickered with a glimmer, then froze. The light above the cloud layer only flickered for a brief moment. But at this moment, It was precisely these minute sparks of electricity that caused a certain inauspicious shadow to reveal a bit of its silhouette. It was still growing. It was still climbing. It was like a tree that twisted and struggled its way out of the crevice of hell. Every time it manifested, it represented the growth of multiple dimensions. Length, surface area, volume, aura, intensity, power level. No, this wasn't growth. This was an explosive proliferation. Gongqi was certain that he had captured the existence of his adversary in time. The adversary was right on the front where his extraordinary domain distorted and interfered with the domain of the Blood-Soul Temple. The adversary was close at hand, and the adversary could interfere at any time. He really did react. Due to the ominous feeling in his heart, he had the thought of nipping the threat in the bud. His methods were fierce and straightforward. This was the third attack. It was slightly inferior to the previous one, but its subtlety far surpassed it. The undulating energy within that region was completely frozen and sucked dry. This sort of suction was so fierce that even the structure of space and time trembled. A small portion of it was annihilated, releasing an even more violent attack. This level of interference pointed directly to the microscopic level. Only the skill and experience of an extraordinary was able to achieve such a powerful effect under the premise that his mental senses were unable to completely comprehend and control the changes on this level. Unsurprisingly, the domain of the Blood-Soul Temple was distorted and torn apart once again. It seemed that it would be difficult to mend it in a short period of time. The rock stratum at the top of the cavern exploded. The originally invisible shockwave was arrogantly exposed through the countless wide cracks that radiated in all directions and continued to extend. The source of all the cracks was the pitch-black hole in the rock stratum. The edge of the hole was smeared with the light formed by the interweaving lava and the greenish-gray cloud pillar. The light itself seemed to possess a corrosive power. It caused the newly formed hole to show signs of collapse in the blink of an eye. According to Gongqi's calculations, the ominous shadow that was explosively proliferating should have been damaged at the same time as the hole. It should have touched the ceiling of its power level. Its soaring momentum was interrupted and it rapidly fell. It was then caught and suppressed by the greenish-gray cloud pillar. In reality, after the greenish-gray cloud pillar tore apart the domain of the Blood-Soul Temple, it had already stirred up its remaining momentum. It was going to smash into the center of the rock stratum and not give the ominous shadow any chance to dodge. The other party did not dodge, but correspondingly, the explosive growth momentum that caused one's heart to palpitate did not weaken in the slightest. It did not seem to be affected at all. It did not give Gongqi any chance to react at all. With that seemingly natural pace, it crushed through the ceiling that ability users from the inner world could not touch. It was like a flight of stairs that a normal person would casually step on. On the front where the greenish-gray cloud pillar and the Blood-Soul Temple's domain contorted and collided, brilliant electric flames flickered once again. They struck and shuttled through the dark-colored cloud pillar, but it was not just a display of power. This was because the countless areas of electric light were formed from innumerable anions, cations and water molecules. Under insufficient or even completely contradictory material conditions, in the complex environment where the extraordinary domain distorted and interfered, they accurately corresponded with the precise structures from other dimensions. They interfered with each other and quickly constructed a tyrannical and stable order of a different kind. Chapter 796. Since it couldn't be shaken, a counterforce followed. Compared to a physical shockwave, a psychological shockwave would explode much earlier. Extraordinary. In Gongqi's eyes, the greenish-gray color that seemed to be sealed in ice cracked. At this moment, the colors and luminosity in front of his eyes rapidly changed. The hole in the rock formation that had just been pierced through was originally colored by the flames and dark clouds. Now, a pure and dazzling light gathered, like the muzzle of a giant spaceship that was accumulating energy and waiting to fire. Dazzling light waves also leaped out from the depths of the distorted cracks. However, there were no signs of leakage. All there was seemingly infinite convergence, binding, and compression. The top of the cloud pillar that was about to smash into the rock formation directly collapsed. The newly constructed region of laws at the entrance of the hole wasn't big, but it was so solid that it left one in despair. And it was precisely this solid strength that had firmly locked onto Gongqi's location within the greenish-gray cloud pillar. It was unwavering and unwavering. In an instant the offensive and defensive positions switched. Gongqi, who had already grasped the absolute initiative, suddenly became the hunting target of others. F***CK. Amidst Gongqi's rare curse, the greenish-gray cumulonimbus cloud that was like a towering cliff suddenly collapsed, and the illusory clouds scattered in all directions. A portion of it quickly evaporated under the high temperature and pressure of the Blood Soul Temple's domain, but most of it settled and expanded, occupying more areas. It also projected Gongqi's unique laws into a wider range. In that instant, the temperature of the Blood Soul Temple domain dropped as a whole. Gongqi's laws formed sufficient interference. Even though it was still far from achieving its goal of suppression, it still gave Gongqi a chance to move in an extremely short period of time. With a hum, the clouds in the area where Gongqi was trembled. His spirit body fluctuated with the tremors before turning incorporeal. Almost at the same time, the ionization channel structure was completed. A dazzling electric dragon rumbled down, completely evaporating the clouds and the corresponding laws where Gongqi was. The air, already distorted under the high temperature and pressure, no longer had the ability to expand or make a sound. It looked like a frozen scene, but it was still shocking. There was no doubt that it was an extraordinary level technique. Gongqi's figure appeared 50 meters away. At that critical moment, he had relied on the interference of the cloud's laws and the corresponding teleportation technique to escape. However, he did not relax in the slightest. There was only unresolvable fear in his heart. Who's that over there? The abyssal zone was sturdy and stable, so it was definitely a psychic. Not to mention, it was the electromagnetic field with the widest range of interference. It seemed like there was no such person in the inner plane. It couldn't be the government or the military, right? Before he could react, another surprise attack came. Behind Gongqi, Madame Halder followed the strange gravitational pull of the net frame and caught onto Gongqi's teleportation destination. She silently arrived and a blood-red light pierced through. Get lost. With a low shout, Gongqi forcefully pushed back the blood light that had pounced at him. This was an unfair collision. Amidst the chaotic blood light, Madame Halder was no longer even recognizable as a human. But that incorporeal blade was accompanied by a mocking laugh. It was as if it had been smeared with corrosive poison and it stabbed right into his heart. The taste of fear is actually not bad. Gongqi seemed to have suffered another heavy punch. In his spirit-body state, he had abandoned most of his useless physiological emotions, like a dried-up river. But at this moment, the stimulation from the explosion had replaced the transmission of neurotransmitters with an even more direct psychic wave current. It had created an even more tragic wound and crack. He had just finished mentally preparing himself and reconstructed his analysis of the situation and corresponding strategies. The heavy punch that came smashing at him didn't just smash his face, it also smashed the foundation of his survival. His mind was in a daze. At this moment, the long scar left by the lightning dragon was still lingering in the clouds, and the light waves in the cracks in the rock stratum had already begun to gather for the second time. His attention was inevitably drawn to it. If the lightning cannons above his head were to fire continuously, and each strike had the same might as the one just now, oh no. Signs of danger suddenly appeared. It didn't come from the cannons above him, but from the trajectory of the lightning dragon. Just as the lightning intersected with the lava at the bottom, a figure suddenly burst out. Taking advantage of the gap in Gongqi's absent-minded state, the figure instantly crushed through the domain space that was still trembling and arrived with a loud bang. There really was a cannonball in the lightning cannon that had just been fired. Gongqi had avoided the first attack, but he ultimately couldn't avoid the second. The threat came suddenly and fiercely. The tyrannical rule interference distorted and destroyed Gongqi's mental sensing network. He could capture the other party's momentum, but he couldn't further analyze it. He instinctively wanted to teleport far away again, but the surrounding turbulent rule environment didn't give him the chance. Helplessly, the green-gray light around his body flickered and extinguished. He gathered the clouds and forcefully constructed the rule to form a sturdy barrier. However, the barrier had just formed when it was forcefully blasted apart. An arm wrapped in metal armor, similarly wrapped in dazzling lightning, blasted toward him. Physical side. His initial judgment was instantly overturned. They were both electromagnetic directions, but how could the mental side and physical side be the same? Especially in his haste, the other party had actually closed in on him. The tyrannical qi and blood in his body rushed back to the abyss area, forming the most troublesome interference field. If his foundation in the abyss area was still intact, he could still forcefully pull it up to a higher level and move toward the polar domain to obtain space to move around. But now that his foundation was destroyed, he would be a beat slower even if he were to improvise during normal times. How could he engage in close combat? Gong Qi's heart palpitated. Almost at the same time, the lightning fist struck his face. The structure of his spirit body collapsed with a hum, and then it entangled with the green-gray essence energy around him. It was as if a gale had swept through the clouds and dispersed in all directions. This was thanks to Gong Qi's out-of-body state, which allowed him to disperse so easily and avoid the frontal attack. But the person who punched didn't make a sound. He slightly retracted his fist, and his body wrapped in exoskeleton armor spun along with the momentum of the fist. It was precisely this spin that instantly transformed the violent impact into a fist stance that was ready to be launched. It could be withdrawn at will, and its rotation was in no way weaker than Gong Qi's in his spirit body state. In particular, the electric current that leaped around his body supported a strong electromagnetic field on the physical plane, and achieved a storm-like disturbance on the mental plane. This kind of switch between offense and defense, as well as powerful control of the field, reflected the stance of a top-notch expert. It was also because of this that Gong Qi couldn't help but expend a bit more effort to reassemble his spirit body. Instead, a certain name naturally flickered in his mind and then it was shot out. Jin Tong. In Gong Qi's memory, there was only one extraordinaire who could control electromagnetic power by his side. Once he was alarmed, that familiar aura imprint was also peeled off from the outer shell of the exoskeleton armor and the strange skin membrane. It was reflected in his mind and there was no doubt about it. Gong Qi's furious thoughts swept through the void, but it didn't trigger any additional reactions. The other party locked onto Gong Qi's spirit body again, and without a word, launched another round of violent attacks. Gong Qi's spirit body structure was once again destroyed with 2 or 3 punches. Jin Tong, you're King crazy. From what Gong Qi knew, Jin Tong was a top-notch wilderness hunter. The metal hunting group under him was quite powerful, and at the same time he had a long-term cooperative relationship with the Ability User Association. After all, the association was the largest distributor of mutant resources in the inner world. Jin Tong's team's annual transactions with the association were in the hundreds of millions, and they involved quite a lot of premium products. To the other party, they were both important clients. With such a background, Gong Qi and Jin Tong naturally had a friendship. Even if they weren't best buddies, they still had contact every year. But what the hell was with the current situation? Gong Qi's mind was in turmoil. Countless thoughts rose and fell, combining into thousands of conspiracy possibilities. Like the shadows of trees swaying in the dark night, they unfolded in his heart. He knew that his condition was terrible, but he couldn't calm down for a moment. In just a few flashes of thought, his spirit body structure was once again destroyed. This time it wasn't because he was actively disintegrating the force, but because it had really been smashed apart by the heavy punch. Gong Qi was really injured. Even though his spirit body was immune to attacks on the material plane, and he had a partial advantage over the fleshly body, this was still unable to completely dissolve Jin Tong's tyrannical blood energy. At the same time, his mental defenses, which had been damaged and then reconstructed, collapsed yet another corner. Countless invisible cracks spread out. This couldn't continue. This absolutely couldn't continue. Gong Qi still didn't understand why Jin Tong would stand by Luo Nan's side. Furthermore, Jin Tong had used the exoskeleton armor to hide his head but show his tail. Perhaps this was an unsolvable riddle. And the more realistic problem was that he had already completely lost the initiative after making consecutive misjudgments. Jin Tong was pressuring him at close range. Jin Tong's powerful fighting style, berserk attacks, and meticulous control of the field was even stronger than what Gong Qi knew. Jin Tong's state was clearly at its peak, and Jin Tong didn't give Gong Qi a chance to catch his breath. With Gong Qi's current half-crippled state, Gong Qi would probably be forcefully ground to death if things continued like this. In this desperate situation, Gong Qi's greenish-gray pupils cracked like a layer of ice before shattering with a bang. In this moment he completely abandoned the structure of his spirit body. He fused with his essence energy that had been tempered 1,000 times to form a haze of light that was half illusory and incorporeal. He forcefully invaded the lightning that coiled around Jin Tong's body. Gong Qi didn't disperse the structure of his spirit body to unload the force. Instead, he wanted to fight Jin Tong on a more detailed, more microscopic level. He wanted to crazily strangle Jin Tong. And the consumption that came from this would increase by several times, dozens of times. It was even possible that the core of Jin Tong's spirit body would be damaged. There would be no end to future troubles. His life was gone. Who cared about future troubles? Mrs. Halder controlled her bloody light to stop on the outskirts. She originally wanted to quietly cut in and see some of the spoils of battle. But the situation entered the most intense level in the first instant. The blazing white lightning and the greenish-gray essence energy permeated and counter-permeated. They resisted and countered, stirring up a dark ring of fire. It noiselessly tore apart the domain of the Blood Soul Temple, isolating a deadly environment. Anyone who tried to force their way in would become the venting point for the clashing forces of two extraordinaries. They would suffer double the damage. She didn't have any chance to intervene. She could only drag her ruined body quietly, sense and wait. One of her eyes had already been blasted apart under the continuous clashes. The crystal had evaporated, but her mind's eye was clear and penetrating. Luo Nan's framework served as a probing needle, and it pierced straight into the depths of the enemy's heart. Gong Qi was truly going all out. He displayed an unprecedented decisiveness. The greenish-gray essence energy was like leaping icy flames within the area where he and Jin Tong fought. It possessed a water-like penetrative power, but it also contained a violent destructive power. The lightning that Jin Tong controlled had already interweaved into a net, but now this net began to warp violently. From time to time, the knots of the net would collapse, the lines would reconnect, and then the net would be reconstructed. The cycle continued. But Gong Qi was terrified. His mental defenses were damaged, reconstructed, and broken. The scars had already been deeply branded into the deepest recesses of his will. He was able to be this decisive right now because the cracks that had opened up were gushing flames of fury. They formed an explosive driving force. Fear and fury were two sides of the same coin. They could switch at any time. How long could Gong Qi last? Under the eruption of near uncontrollable power, under the suction of the framework net. Mrs. Halder furrowed her brows slightly. Within the dark ring of fire where the extraordinaries fought, a strange colored flame suddenly flickered. It came from Jin Tong's body, which had been as steady as a mountain. It was the exoskeleton armor wrapped around his body. A layer of flame had burned through it, leaving behind shallow scorch marks and ashes. And in the area where the flame had yet to burn out, the fascia-like foreign body that was wrapped around him was only an insignificant amount. It was still twitching under the roasting as if it was alive. Tisk. Mrs. Halder could clearly hear someone smacking his tongue in annoyance. Gong Qi, who was within the ring of battle, felt it more directly. The pressure from Jin Tong's side suddenly dropped, and an inconceivable break appeared in the tempestuous rhythm of attacks. Hence, Gong Qi's thoughts had already fallen far behind his instinctive reactions in this moment where the rules and energy interweaved. He made the most correct action in an instant. The greenish-gray essence energy instantly converged. Its light and color were purified to the point of being nearly transparent. At the same time, it was tempered to a sharpness that exceeded the limits of its limits. It also possessed a dark damage that could corrode the soul. Under the guidance of the energy, it seized the breakpoint that shouldn't have appeared and pierced straight in. The sharp essence energy spear directly pierced into the center of the exoskeleton armor's visor. It pierced through 2 layers of metal armor and the flesh and blood in the middle. It went forward and out, completely penetrating through. It hit. At this moment, Gong Qi was somewhat at a loss. It wasn't easy for his lagging thoughts to catch up, but an irrelevant thought appeared in his mind. He remembered that Jin Tong was too casual when it came to controlling electromagnetic energy. He also had the special ability to transform his body into metal. The two complemented each other and were enough to support a complete system of rules. Therefore, he didn't really like it or was very good at cooperating with exoskeleton armor. It was also very difficult for there to be a vehicle in the world that was suitable for him to carry his extraordinary strength. Is this guy in front of me really Jin Tong? The sudden reversal of the situation also reversed the direction of the power. Gong Qi's attack caused the deadlock between the two to lose balance, and it poured out in the direction of the weaker side. The strength of the exoskeleton armor's structure couldn't withstand this level of impact. In the blink of an eye, it twisted and collapsed. Of course, the first to collapse was the visor that had suffered a direct hit. A strange bloody light seeped out. Gong Qi's senses pierced through the broken metal outer shell and the strange bloody light. He locked onto the distorted face that still gave him a familiar feeling. Jin Tong. Oh, it wasn't. At least not at certain times. In the bloody light, a blurry face that was still pierced by the essence Qi spear was melting. Jin Tong's facial features reappeared, like a clay work that had been pinched. But just as this face was formed, it distorted and melted away. The blurry face from before replaced it, bringing with it an indescribable familiarity and unfamiliarity. Then it distorted, melted, replaced, and the cycle repeated. That's my face? Rumble. Gong Qi's thoughts suddenly left the established track. Amidst the rumbling sounds, he seemed to have crashed off a cliff, tumbling and struggling in the void. It was precisely because of this that he didn't notice that Lady Halder, who had been waiting outside for a long time, had once again controlled the bloody light and silently charged forward. Gong Qi fell into a state of uncontrollable thinking. There were many things he understood, but there were still many things he didn't understand. But no matter what, that turbid and malevolent truth that contained great cruelty and great terror smashed into the depths of his heart, transforming into a demonic claw that fiercely clawed at him. The front of the essence Qi was still in front of him. That incomparably familiar face was trembling and stirring. Even if it was a living person, even if it was a transcendent, 99% of them would still die. Lady Halder's aura was rapidly weakening, but Gong Qi was also rapidly weakening. This was a weakening of the spiritual plane to the point of collapse. The barrier of will shattered with a rumble. His emotions were like an erupting volcano, exploding with destructive flames and emitting a sharp howl in the chaotic spiritual world. Lady Halder closed in, and the bloody light pierced into the depths of the azure-gray essence Qi that had just gathered. But in the next moment the azure-gray light exploded outwards. Freezing and exploding, two completely different types of killing power simultaneously struck Lady Halder's body. The bloody light condensed and then exploded. Lady Halder's already badly damaged body seemed to have been stripped of all flesh and blood. All that was left was a twisted skeleton that was still burning fiercely. But it was this twisted burning skeleton that firmly absorbed the azure-gray essence Qi in front of it. It was as if it had been smeared with superglue, or perhaps it had been thoroughly magnetized. Deputy Secretary General Gong, you don't have a chance anymore. The repeated declaration was like a poisoned blade that pierced through him a second time. Gong Qi roared. He wanted to tear apart Lady Halder, who was twisting around him. At the same time he wanted to tear apart the rapidly weakening, but still tenaciously existing nightmarish face. But he was also weakening. At the core of his spiritual body, a shadow of nothingness was rapidly spreading out. It was like a plant that devoured flesh and blood. After growing stronger in secret, it would reveal its malevolent face and openly inject poison into his blood, carrying out a terrifying transformation. Behind the fury was fear. After two violent struggles, Gong Qi was still unable to break free from Lady Halder, nor was he able to resist the swallowing of the shadow at the bottom of his heart. Then his emotions would naturally overturn, and a cold wind of fear would blow into the cracks in his collapsed heart. It was quite ironic that his thoughts returned at this moment. Gong Qi completely understood. His opponent's main direction of attack had never been the suppression of the Blood Soul Temple's domain. It wasn't Lady Halder. It wasn't the extraordinary that had driven him mad. His opponent had been corroding his mind from beginning to end, injecting a fatal poison into the depths of his heart. This was similar to the methods of the Darksider species. It was the ultimate move that the apex masters of the mind were proficient in. Luonan was a master of the mind. Gong Qi suddenly stirred. This was the first time he had given the youth a clear position. Seeing his opponent clearly was tantamount to seeing himself clearly. In his days he seemed to have grasped a thread of hope. Although Luonan held the upper hand, he had used all his trump cards. He had no backup plans. This place wasn't far from Spring City. Right now, two great combat powers were tangling with him. The Blood Soul Temple's domain had ruptured open during the battle. It was hard to isolate the inside from the outside. Even if he couldn't teleport away, he just needed to slow down and drag out the deadlock. The aura of an extraordinary would most likely be able to attract the attention of others. The ground shook. It was as if a drum was heavily pounding on his chest. The lava cavern was shaking. The source of the shaking came from the turbulence of the structure of the void. Gray mist was seeping in from a certain part of the broken domain of the Blood Soul Temple. The crack that the Blood Soul ants had pierced through and fixed in place. It was clearly only wisps, but the moment it seeped in, the high temperature and pressure of the infernal inferno was smeared with a layer of indescribable gray matter. The luminosity of the entire lava cavern suddenly dimmed. Gong Qi's mind trembled. This was because he was certain that these wisps of gray mist came from the mist maze he had just escaped from not too long ago. This wasn't mist. It was a domain fragment. It was a space-time structural element that was refined to the extreme. The change in luminosity of the lava cavern only proved one thing. These refined space-time components were rapidly infiltrating and fusing with the domain of the Blood Soul Temple. There were practically no conflicts at all in this grand and complex project that made one's scalp go numb. Even if there were, they would be adjusted at an inconceivable speed. This series of processes looked like scribbles that were casually drawn, but the final result was clearly the most exquisite of meticulous paintings. In terms of the construction of spacetime, this was a gap that made one despair. And what was even more despairing was that the gap in the domain that had just been exposed had already been completely mended in the time of a few breaths. Its tenacity was even greater than before. Could it be that he had to be called a spacetime master in addition to a spiritual master? Gong Qi's spiritual senses wandered around blankly. In the depths of his mind, a shadow that was like a moldy and rotten lump continued to expand. Perhaps it was because he had assimilated to a certain level, but for the first time he clearly captured that invisible towering frame net. His mind probed and was immediately enveloped by a blazing light. The sun, the seemingly familiar sun of the abyss. In the dark and boundless deep sky, the sun sat in the center. Spider webs weaved densely and bloody light flowed. That was the frequent exchange and transformation of vitality and origin energy. A considerable portion of it came from his body. At this moment, Gong Qi was clearly a mosquito that had been tied up into a cocoon. Countless spider webs entangled him and countless nodes were digested. There was no chance or hope for him. Ha ha ha. Gong Qi suddenly let out another roar. The scene of the spiritual world collapsed amidst the roar and he returned to the plane of reality. Before his eyes was a dark red space. It was the embryonic form of some domain. The local spacetime, the domain of the Blood Soul Temple, and the domain fragment of the Misty Labyrinth. If these three structures completely converged and fused together, this would be the extraordinary domain. It would not be an exaggeration to call Luo Nan a spacetime master at that time. But right now, he was still a bit short. The crux of the matter lay in the fact that no powerful person in the world could evolve into a domain with just a strand of thought. This proved that Luo Nan, the psychic and spacetime genius, was here. Perhaps he had just arrived, or perhaps he had been hiding here for a long time. In any case, the youth was here. He was within the range of his attack and slaughter. Ever since the battle began, Gong Qi's mind had never been this clear and this focused. Death was a foregone conclusion, and the final hindrance vanished in a puff of smoke. His extraordinary level mental senses radiated the most penetrating rays of light, illuminating this extremely vast yet imperfect void. Then Gong Qi caught a glimpse of a figure. That figure should also be in a spirit body state. A sharp howl rang out, and the green-gray essence energy instantly ignited and purified. It was just like how it pierced through the extraordinary body. It burned with hatred and fury, tempered into the sharpest of spears and swords, and shot across the sky. Die. Gong Qi had already exhausted everything he had in this fearless attack, including the teleportation technique that he had been unable to use due to the interference of the domain. Thus he erased practically all of the distance between them. The spear and sword of essence energy had already arrived in front of the target's face. The abyssal region, no, an even higher region, operated marvelously. The spirit body figure that originally existed in the world suddenly rose to a higher level, taking a step upwards. This step was from the real to the virtual. This step was beyond the reach of his strength. Gong Qi burst forth with another howl, and at this moment he suddenly saw a pair of unfamiliar and cold eyes. The eyes were extremely close, yet they were very far away. It was loathsome. Gong Qi instinctively wanted to destroy these eyes, But in this instant, it was as if he had fallen into a long winding river. He went against the waves and struggled forward, but he was swept even further away by the torrent of water. The ice-cold waves washed over him, taking away his energy and vitality, taking away his life force and spiritual light, taking away his emotions and thoughts, taking away everything that should be a life. All that was left was old, decaying, and other worthless things. Gong Qi howled and struggled forward. Finally he saw a slightly familiar face. It was one of his most profound memories before he fell into the cloud world. It was the girl who attracted him to Xia City, the girl who was worth 2,000th of the shares of the Deep Blue Project. He did not know that his thoughts and the corresponding state of mind formed a nearly perfect mirror image of Jin Tong, who had fiercely fought him before his death. Chapter 797. May 3, 2097, 3:00 a.m. Yin Lu lowered her head once more. She looked at the exquisite lady's wristwatch on her wrist and confirmed the time. The living area on the lower deck was perfectly soundproof. It was quiet and still. The main light in the small living room between the rooms was never turned on, but the orange night light was on. It interweaved with the soft light of the projection work area, illuminating the corners, the floor, and the silhouette of a person who had been asleep for a long time on the sofa. Or rather an empty shell. In the past 10 hours, there was practically no change in this area aside from the adjustment of the lighting. Compared to the material plane, the result of the perception on the mental plane was the complete opposite. This was especially true for the vibrations that originated from the Blood Soul Temple in the Abyss District. It was nearly the same time as Luonan's slumber. It had never stopped since the beginning. There were even a few periods where the vibrations were so intense that it seemed as if they would collapse in the next moment. It nearly jolted Yin Li's heart out of her chest. Throbbing, anxious, and fearful emotions followed her like a shadow. Even so, she still had to force herself to remain calm. She did her best to pacify the upper echelons of the order who didn't know what was going on. She wanted to prevent them from muddle-headedly doing stupid things. Fine. In fact, her so-called knowing was nothing more than a half-assed explanation. She could only passively wait on the yacht right now. A few minutes ago, the Blood Soul Temple in the Abyss District had just passed through an intense period. Right now, the operating momentum was very calm. Yin Lu let out a sigh of relief for the time being. She diverted some of her attention to look at the psychic diagram that had appeared on the projection work area for a long time. Perhaps it was a misconception caused by the long period of observation. She felt that this scene of a tornado on the sea gave her a strange feeling of unfamiliarity. It was like looking at a word for a long time and suddenly not being able to recognize it. At this time, the sound of static came from the built-in headphones. The captain of the yacht took the initiative to contact her. "Manager Yin, there's a situation. The hull has suddenly become heavy." Yin Lu didn't understand for a moment. "What did you say?" "The hull's draft is increasing. It's like 10 tons of cargo being smashed. It's already exceeded the design draft, but it's still going on. It's not far from the upper limit of the structure's draft. We may have fallen into a trap." The captain had just retired from the army not long ago. His words carried the air of a bandit. In fact, the sound of a gun being pulled rang out from the other side. Clearly, the crew area was already nervous. Yin Li's heart was tense, but the situation she faced was much more complicated than the captain's considerations. How could she make a decision so easily? Just as his scalp swelled with pain, a faint sound came from the side of the sofa. It seemed to be Luonan making a sound from his nostrils. Yin Lu couldn't see too clearly, but she could feel that Luonan had woken up. His eyelids were moving, opening a sliver, but he hadn't completely lifted his head. It was like waking up after long sleep. Half of his consciousness was still in a dream. Yin Lu was stunned for a moment before ecstasy surged in her heart. At this moment, the hull of the ship shook slightly, and the originally well-soundproof living area could also hear the roar of coughing coming from the stern of the ship. The ray yacht cruising on the surface of the lake suddenly slowed down. Those with keen senses like Yin Lu could even feel the yacht sinking. Clearly, the situation reported by the captain was getting worse. It was at this time that Luonan opened his eyes. Yin Lu noticed that the color of Luonan's pupils was a bit strange. At first there was a layer of gray and then a dark red color. But as his eyelids blinked, these miscellaneous colors quickly faded away and were replaced by a bright light. It seemed to be brighter than the light source in the room, so much so that the projection work area was dimmed. Sir. Yinlu subconsciously felt that something was wrong and called out to them. Luo Nan, who was on the sofa, clearly heard her and turned his head. But the air in the small living room let out a cracking sound following his movements. It was as if the ropes were unable to bear the burden and broke apart. In this instant, Yinlu felt as if she had been pushed hard by someone. She staggered back and fell onto the stairs that she had entered from. And she was clearly lucky because the sofa in front of her, which was carrying Luo Nan, had crumbled. The surrounding coffee table and even the bar further away had twisted and deformed. It was as if they had been smashed by a heavy hammer. Even the bottom of the cabin had collapsed. But Luo Nan still maintained a relaxed sitting posture under such an unforeseen event. Even though the bottom of his body was already a hole in the bottom of the cabin that had collapsed, Luo Nan's state was indeed relaxed. There was clearly some sort of invisible force carrying him. It didn't seem like he had been ambushed. Then perhaps it would be more appropriate to call him the initiator? Manager Yin. Manager Yin. The captain shouted loudly. Clearly, he had discovered the unforeseen event in the living area. Yinlu just sat on the stairs. She was unable to understand the current situation, so it was hard for her to give a response. Luo Nan, who was sitting calmly, even had the leisure to fiddle with the work area in front of him. This virtual projection was probably the only thing that remained unchanged aside from him. Then he turned his face once more and smiled at the nearby Yinlu. Tidy up a bit. While he was speaking, a hole burst open in the wall behind Luo Nan from the distortion of the wooden planks and steel plates. He shrugged his shoulders and his body floated backwards. The virtual work area still flickered with light as it penetrated through the side of the yacht. It sank down and soon entered the depths of the lake. Yinlu got up and walked to the damaged side of the yacht in a few steps. She looked at the crack in the twisted steel plates in a daze. She only remembered to reply to the captain after a few seconds. She told him to send a crew over to begin the miserable comprehensive inspection process. It was night. North Mountain Lake was covered in a thick fog. The aberrations in the surrounding area were clearly restless. The sound of wind, the sound of water, and the howling continued without end. The people on the entire yacht were frightened and confused as they passed through the thick fog. As for the instigator Luo Nan, he walked slowly underwater, going deeper and deeper. North Mountain Lake was essentially a dammed lake. Its deepest depth was over 200 meters. At the bottom of the lake were the remains of a large number of pre-World War III city buildings. Right now, they had become the nests of all kinds of underwater creatures and even aberrations. It was said that the government of Banqing City had been trying to explore and excavate. They even wanted to build a memorial at the bottom of the lake. However, with Luo Nan's arrival tonight, the remains of the buildings at the bottom of the lake were really unlucky. An invisible pressure came from the originally unrelated spacetime. Because of Luo Nan's existence, a portion of the structure interfered with the local spacetime, causing fine vibrations. Moreover, a large amount of undigested gambling capital flowed within this external spacetime structure. This increased the strength and weight of the interference. These gambling capital came from the grand gamble within the sacrificial altar framework constructed by the Wraith sign. The gamblers were Gong Qi, Lady Halder and Rui Wen, who had interfered in the end. The banker presiding over the gambling house was undoubtedly Luo Nan. However, he had already completely lost his impartial standpoint. Together with the Wraith sign who had constructed the sacrificial altar, he had gambled against his only opponent, Gong Qi. Gong Qi was powerless to destroy this situation. He didn't even see through the essence of this gambling house. The final result conformed to the logic that it should have. The only unexpected thing was that the course of events was much more relaxed than expected. From beginning to end, Gong Qi's counterattack was unable to truly touch the weak points and fatal points of Luo Nan's side. All of Gong Qi's struggles didn't deviate from Luo Nan's initial plans. This was undoubtedly the foundation of planning and the formation of a system of knowledge that took as long as half a year. It was the accumulation of a large amount of time in exchange for an instant explosive battle result. Luo Nan's rationality was able to analyze and explain when faced with such a battle result. However, there were times when he couldn't help but feel his heart soar. So it turns out that I can do this much. I can do this well. So it turns out that the power I can mobilize is this powerful. Luo Nan stopped at a certain high point in the gloomy depths of the water. This place should have been some high-grade office building from before the Third World War. Perhaps it was a landmark building from back in the day. The quality of the building was exceptionally good. It had withstood the flood peaks and mudslides of several decades ago. It had also withstood the water pressure of the past few years, as well as the torment of the mutants. Luo Nan stood at the edge of the roof. He spread his arms and took deep breaths. He was controlling his emotions, but he was also enjoying this moment of achievement. The bottom of the lake didn't give him a normal living environment, but the interference of the alternate space-time structure was Luo Nan's strongest safeguard. Gongqi had lost everything there. His extraordinary level soul structure and vast energy had been reduced to Lady Halder's next level of resources. And it was far beyond that. Ruiwen had cut off Gongqi's life force. It was reasonable to say that she should have obtained a large portion, but she seemed to have reached a bottleneck. She didn't take too much. In addition, the Wraith sign guided and diverted a portion to be used as operating costs and future reserves for the Cobweb altar. The 3 Blood Soul temples shared some of the benefits. The built-in puppets and related believers all shared some of the benefits. But even like this, it wasn't completely divided. The rest was stored with Luo Nan, allowing his soul strength to explosively increase once more. Before this, every time Luo Nan's soul strength exploded with explosive growth, it was accompanied by a near-fatal risk of imbalance between his body and soul. But this time the risk didn't come as expected. This was because a firm and highly efficient water conservancy project had appeared between his body and soul, which was still severely imbalanced. Perhaps it could be called Luo Nan's domain. The destructive expansion of his soul strength as well as the large amount of undigested gambling capital, together with the unceasing mobilization and assembly of the configuration fragments, seeped into the precise space-time structure bit by bit, undergoing an even deeper transformation. From the peak of a flood that splashed the sky, it transformed into an unending stream of electricity. Everything was clearly natural and smooth. Luo Nan understood that the most crucial factor within this was the configuration theory that he gradually grasped in depth. This knowledge system, which clearly surpassed the current level of Earth, rapidly solidified the foundation of his existence in this world. This was a good beginning, but it was merely a beginning. The psychic diagram continued to flash in the virtual work area in front of him. Luo Nan's gaze fell upon the sea tornado that originally belonged to Gongqi. Following his attentive gaze, the fine lines and shadow structure continued to transform. During this process, Luo Nan's previously fluttering state of mind continued to settle as the details of the outline changed. Luo Nan gradually returned to tranquility. It was time to enter the arena. He had transformed from a pseudo-transcendent compositor into a true participant. This was because he possessed the ability to stand on equal footing with the other sea tornadoes right now. Chapter 798. Early in the morning, light shone through the shadows of the wood and stones in the garden. The warm light from the stone lamps in the houses automatically extinguished, allowing the light of nature to decorate the place. For a moment, the garden seemed to be filled with a thin layer of mist, cold and quiet. However, it was already late spring, less than 2 days before the beginning of summer. In many people's hearts, Ban City had already become hot. Yukawa Isuk knelt on the platform of the veranda and said nothing. He watched as the bamboo tube filled to the brim sent the clear stream into the shallow pond. Then it snapped back to normal, startling the birds that had woken up early and causing them to flutter away. It was supposed to be a classic Zen skit, but his mind was like the birds that flew away, unable to calm down for a long time. Next to him, the head of intelligence, Takemoto Shigeru, was reporting in a low voice. Up until now, the Jade Light's voyage plan has not changed, but many of the people who made reservations and were invited have not been confirmed. Some people even cancelled the trip because they were not feeling well. Yukawa Aishuk waved his hand. Those who boarded the ship from Ban City are just supporters. Even 100 of Ban City's richest people can't compare to the president of the Ability User Association. President Abner returned to Chan City and confirmed that he would not participate in the auction. They can't even find a target to applaud. Takemoto Shigeru's voice was low. Regarding this matter, we can basically confirm that something has happened in Chan City. They have sealed off the news, but from multiple sources about 20 hours ago, there was a strong energy reaction near Volcano Island. It is suspected that there was a conflict between extraordinaries, including death. Takemoto Shigeru was shocked. Yukawa Aishuk sat up straight. showing his cautious attitude towards the current situation. Just 2 minutes ago he received the latest news from the Jade Society. On Volcano Island, Deputy Secretary Gong Qi, who had been in isolation for a long time, had his body destroyed. This news was beyond the scope of information that Takamoto Shigeru usually received and processed. For a moment he didn't know how to react. He vaguely guessed that Yukawa Aishuk was also shocked by the news, which was why he took the initiative to tell him about it. Because of this, Takamoto Shigeru automatically shut up and didn't make any comments, pretending that he was mute. Sometimes rumors can become the truth. I've always been skeptical about the legend of Gong Qi discovering a new plane, but now I can almost confirm that it's true. Moreover, the situation is more complicated than expected. Now there's a guess. Gong Qi wasn't the only one who discovered the new plane. There were other people who intervened and took the opportunity to stab Gong Qi in the back. I don't want to talk about these things because it has nothing to do with us. Yukawa Aishuk looked at Takamoto Shigeru. It seemed that the intelligence chief could understand his feelings. Takamoto Shigeru continued to play dumb. Even a pond under a typhoon cannot remain as calm as a mirror. Yukawa Aishuk stared at the shallow puddle under the bamboo tube. There were no longer any ripples, but the impatience in his heart had not dissipated. The Ability User Association has begun to investigate the whereabouts of all the extraordinaries in the world, including the military movements of the various forces, down to the solidification of the abysses. Takamoto Mao's eyelids twitched. Thanks to Professor Luo's lectures over the past few months and the dissemination of relevant concepts, even a person like him who was lacking in cultivation had a conceptual understanding of the abyssal region configuration system. And the clearer it was, the more he understood the turbulent impact of this wave of operations. This was no longer just a fight between immortals. It had actually affected their side. So Takamoto Mao opened his mouth. A major investigation? Haha, it's a stupid idea because there's no clue at all. Let's not talk about the extraordinaries. All the orders will be investigated. Ban City is no exception. Even though we're separated by the Pacific Ocean, we can't avoid being caught in the crossfire. Ban City was known as the City of 10,000 Gods. Or maybe it was a mockery, but it was an indisputable fact that there were many orders here. In particular, there was a portion of them that was supported by the Yukawa family. There were too many things to sort out. Yukawa Aishuk instructed, "We'll investigate ourselves, but we'll also have to communicate with the Ban City branch and do the relevant things well. Now, we're not afraid of doing things, we're only afraid of people taking advantage of the opportunity to stir up trouble. So some things must be done first." "You mean?" Takamoto Shigeru could tell what he was implying, so he asked again. When I received the information from the Jade Review Society, someone told me that we need to calm things down and focus on the overall situation. According to our president's strategy, we should focus on attacking the broken lands. I agreed. Yukawa Aishuk's lips curled, his cheeks twitching. But 2 minutes later, the Amaterasu cult called and asked to take the lead in this investigation, so that Ban City can be restored to a peaceful environment. At this point, Takamoto Mao finally understood the source of Yukawa Aishuk's bad mood. They're going to reap another harvest? Yes. When most people are constrained by the overall situation and have to make sacrifices for it, there are some strong people who can ignore it and even make use of it. Isn't that stubborn guy still in Luo Yuandao's lab? I didn't expect his father to be so good as well. Takamoto Mao did not speak. He only took a deep breath and recalled the time when the Amaterasu cult used Ban City as the cauldron, and many orders as ingredients to brew a pot of fresh soup. Now that one batch had been cut, a new batch had grown. Yukawa Aishuk's resentment was not only directed at the Amaterasu cult. Everyone knows that Gong Qi has been in closed-door training for half a year. He was in closed-door training because he was forced back from Xia City by the Iron Triangle. He failed to kidnap Luonan. A new plane was involved and Xia City was in chaos. Back then Luonan was publishing the shocking cage and configuration theory. Now that something has happened, Xia City, no, Luonan's side is making a big move. They're staying out of this. Yukawa Aishuk suddenly stopped talking, staring blankly. Takamoto Mao's eyelids twitched. He felt that this line of thought was very dangerous. Fortunately, Yukawa Aishuk waved his hand. He just left Xia City. Even if he flew, he couldn't have flown there. It seemed very strange for him to explain it in such a serious manner. The two looked at each other again. Yukawa Aishuk gave an order. Go to your job. Be thorough. Takamoto Mao got up, took 3 steps back, turned around and left. Only Yukawa Aishuk was left under the eaves. He stared at the gradually brightening garden in silence. Around the same time, Snake Tongue slowly woke up in a high-class residence on the southern shore of North Mountain. Her eyes were half open. She moved her fingers and calves, slowly unblocking her blood vessels. Speaking of which, she had been lying on the tatami in the living room for a week. Her body's functions had inevitably declined. It was hard for her to get up for a while. There were finger-sized holes all around her body. These were the marks left behind by Mr. Georgia Wei men. It was just this one wave. He really didn't care about her for the time being. If she hadn't woken up in time, she might have turned into a rotten corpse. Yeah, I guess I was lucky. Snake Tongue laughed self-deprecatingly. She temporarily stopped struggling and looked at the dust under the morning sun. She was stunned speechless. Since she had been lying here for a long time, it was hard for the AI housekeeper to clean the room. A layer of dust had accumulated on the tatami after a few days. Her body was also covered in dust. She felt very uncomfortable in her mind. Snake Tongue loved cleanliness. She immediately ordered, "Mr. Hideji, prepare the hot spring." "As you command, madam." The high-class AI housekeeper responded with a mature and experienced voice. The room came alive in an instant. Several minutes later, Snake Tongue finally succeeded in struggling to get up. The first thing she did was enter the garden's hot spring pool to clean herself. All 4 sides were made of floor-to-ceiling sliding glass doors that formed a flowing space that seemed to be continuous. The center was filled with a pool of warm soup. She lay naked in it and sank to the bottom of the pool. Her skin was in full contact with the water. The minute water pressure, the different heat sensations of various parts of her body, the changes in temperature brought about by the ripples in the pool, and even the natural suffocation. The feeling of her body was so rich, exquisite, and real. In the past, she had never cared about or even looked down on her low-level perception. Now she felt that it wasn't enough no matter what. She could only experience it layer by layer, bit by bit. The warm water in the pool changed twice before Snake Tongue stood up, still not fully satisfied. Following her movements, one of the floor-to-ceiling glass windows automatically turned into a mirror. She looked at the graceful and slender body in the mirror, suffused with the luster of life. She stared blankly again. Her fingertips unconsciously streaked across her chest and touched her cheeks. She immediately chanted an incantation and peeled off a fog-like veil. Having lost the camouflage effect of the veil of invisibility, the face in the mirror was both similar and different from a few seconds ago. It was precisely this face in the mirror that faintly furrowed her brows. Her emotions couldn't be clearly discerned, but the surroundings were covered in mist. The hazy mist was different from the mist in the warm spring. It was suffused with a peculiar gray substance. Snake Tongue's mind shivered. She didn't care about her current state of being completely naked. She prostrated herself on the ground. However, no information was transmitted from the mist. There was only an insignificant weight that fell on her back. He almost thought it was an illusion. In fact, that unique feeling and the subtle gravitational pull of the veil of invisibility beside her hand clearly told Snake Tongue the answer. The veil of silence. She had once yearned for it in her dreams, a wondrous item that she had nearly gambled her life on, and it had fallen into her hands just like that. At this moment, Snake Tongue's heart was like the mist in a hot spring. It was overflowing and empty. The feeling was indescribable. She maintained her kneeling position for nearly 3 minutes. After confirming that there were no further instructions, she pulled off the veil of silence from her back and stood up. She naturally combined the 2 strands of fine yarn together. They could sense each other, but they were still a bit lacking. Snake Tongue wasn't disappointed. This was all within reason. What's more, this sort of matter was nothing. "Mr. Hideji, a news bulletin. Also prepare a car for me." Snake Tongue left the hot spring room and composed herself for a bit. She used the AI butler to activate the myriad spirit sect's internal system. All sorts of information began to converge here. The 2 orbits of the secular world and the inner world practically didn't intersect. Under normal circumstances, this would be the case. However, the current situation was that there was a piece of news that stood at the same time as the hot topic of both domains. The Flying Devil Ray. The humanoid infrasonic array. Snake Tongue constantly updated herself with recent information. At the same time, she spent even more energy earnestly grooming herself. Before long, the radiant Lady Kitayama Yuki appeared in the dressing mirror. The car arrived and Snake Tongue dressed up and went out. When she left, it was 9 o'clock on May 3, 2097. Miraculously, there was a 24-hour difference from the earliest time the news broke out. Chapter 799. Mrs. Kitashin Yuehui, who had always lived in seclusion, suddenly went out in a car. This became a moderate amount of news in this residential area. The housewives cast their gazes from the gardens, streets, bedrooms, and other positions and angles. They gathered all sorts of details and prepared them for today's conversation. Those gazes and vulgar thoughts certainly couldn't be hidden from Snake Tongue. In the past, she simply couldn't be bothered to waste her thoughts on such matters. But today she looked through the car window and swept her gaze over this residential area with great interest. She looked at the gardens on both sides of the road as well as the faintly familiar faces inside and outside the gardens. Compared to the boundless and repetitive clouds, so what if it was vulgar? Those pale faces smeared with foundation and lipstick also glowed with a gorgeous color. The hired professional driver drove silently. The relevant route had already been properly arranged. After leaving the residential area, they entered the main road around the lake on the southern shore of Beishan Lake. The foundation of this high-standard magnetic track was extremely high. When it was first constructed, it served as a second breakwater. As the car drove on it, they could clearly see the boundless blue waves of Beishan Lake. As for the strong and sturdy camphor tree on the lakeside, it was nearly 30 meters tall. It firmly pressed down on the main road around the lake. Even from here they still had to look up. Looking at the extended branches of the tree crown, it was truly like the arm of a giant spirit stretched horizontally between Beishan Lake and Ban City. Caused people to involuntarily feel reverence. It was precisely because of this majestic appearance and the miraculous stories that had been passed down for several decades that Mr. Jorajiman still had no lack of incense offerings, even during the day or on a working day. Snake Tongue could feel a certain spirituality that was becoming increasingly perfect through the incense and faith. It revolved and flowed, combing the dual environment of matter and spirit, nourishing and strengthening it little by little. Her gaze was cold and clear and her thoughts were cold. At the same time there was also a thought that swept past the car. The two sides touched and then separated. It could be considered a greeting, but the mood was cold. Snake Tongue didn't reprimand Jorajiman, and the latter didn't have any intention of apologizing. The friendship between the two was roughly like this. Half a year was enough for them to be completely consumed, so it wasn't strange. As for the future direction of the jointly established Myriad Spirit Order, or even the future of the two, whether it was Snake Tongue or the Jordan Gate, they didn't have the authority to take the lead. This was because there was a certain lord on the surface of North Mountain Lake. Snake Tongue and Zhou Xian both consciously and unconsciously followed the will of that person. Snake Tongue was the conscious one. As for Mr. Zhou Xian, it would depend on how he would react later. The car quickly turned off Lake Circle Drive. Snake Tongue had already prepared a boat here. She was prepared to go to the lake to pay her respects to that person. But before she could set off, she saw a fishing boat on the lake. On the boat was a familiar young woman who was smiling at her from afar. Soon the two sides met at the pier. Snake Tongue had already thought about it. She had indeed seen this woman before her. A week ago Luonan had summoned her soul and summoned her soul. Her soul and body were one for a short period of time, and she would occasionally see this face. It was just that it was hidden in a dreamy and illusory mist. It was hard to tell if it was real or fake. Right now there was no need to bother distinguishing. It was certainly someone close to Luonan without a doubt. Even though Snake Tongue was able to determine that this person's cultivation was a level lower than hers, she still bowed respectfully in greeting. Sinner Snake Tongue greets the High Envoy. Inli's eyes stirred slightly. Snake Tongue wore a traditional kimono. She came in splendid attire. Her words and actions were humble and ancient. She simply adopted the posture of paying respect to a god. Naturally, she elevated Luonan to an extremely lofty position. Then could she, a temporary secretary, Truly be able to steadily occupy a position as lofty as that of a god? Yin Li's thoughts turned to one side and she smiled. She avoided Snake Tongue's greeting and bowed slightly at the same time. I don't dare. My humble name is Yin Lu. I am the Vice Ablatum of the Blood Flame Order. I follow the orders of the First Ablatum to serve by Mr.'s side. I don't deserve the title of High Envoy. The Blood Flame Order? The one from Xia City? Snake Tongue didn't participate in the final battle to kill Gong Qi, so she had no way of knowing of the close relationship between Luonan and the Blood Flame Order. It was hard not to be surprised when she heard this. But this was not the time for her to ask clearly. She could only suppress the suspicions in her mind and maintain a respectful and submissive posture. She hoped that Yin Lu would pass on the message and allow her to meet her lord. The response from the other side was rather odd. Ms. North Mountain, according to Mr., you're a fan of the Mountain Stream Band? Snake Tongue raised her head in shock and saw Yin Li's deep smile. Her mind immediately flashed and she responded a second later, what the Lord says is naturally correct. An intelligent person's intelligent reply. In this way Yin Lu saved quite a bit of talking. She faintly sensed that Snake Tongue's existence would create a certain amount of competition for her. But from a rational perspective she clearly understood that there was no meaning in this so-called jealousy. Her duty was to ensure that the information was accurately transmitted down the chain of command. It just so happens that Mountain Stream is currently rehearsing. Ms. North Mountain can go take a look. You're an actor and they're singers. The difference in their fields is quite large. But no matter how you look at it, you're still an artist. You're their senior. You can interact with them at a close distance. Oh, I just so happen to have something to do in the city. Can I hitch a ride? Of course. Snake Tongue invited Yin Lu into the car. There was a bit of modesty between the two. In the end, Yin Lu chose the seat behind the driver, leaving the front passenger seat for Snake Tongue. The car drove to the center of Sakura City. On the way, Yin Lu gave Snake Tongue information on the Mountain Stream Band, especially information on the relationship between Moya and Luonan. She also gave a general explanation of the current situation. Actually, Yin Lu herself didn't quite understand why Snake Tongue was involved. She didn't even understand the process of Luonan awakening and subduing this former enemy of hers. On the other side, Snake Tongue felt deep disbelief towards the background of Luonan being threatened. The Yuchuan family actually did such a thing to threaten a deity that had slain extraordinaries. Was it because their lord was too low-key? Both sides had unresolved suspicions, but they were intimidated by Luonan's existence, so it wasn't easy for them to communicate in depth. The two vaguely came to a realization. They were two pieces of a puzzle in Luonan's hands. They were placed in different areas according to the will of that person. As for the complete picture, it probably only existed in Luonan's heart. Or perhaps it would only appear in its entirety at the final stage. Regardless of whether it was Snake Tongue or Yin Lu, they were both people who were good at communicating. After opening the door to the driver's seat, there was no need to worry about the driver. They soon found many new topics to talk about. For example, the Jordan Gate and the Myriad Spirit Order, the relationship between the Blood Flame Order and Luonan, and so on. Although it wasn't to the extent of revealing everything, it could help each other understand and communicate more. In the end, they talked about Luonan's current activities. Yin Lu was actually a bit distressed. The Ray needs to be docked for a complete overhaul. It will take at least a week. Mr. will need to find another ride for his daily needs. But it's not easy to find a yacht of the same specifications in a short period of time without leaving any traces. Luonan didn't care about his living conditions, but a secretary like Yin Lu had to be perfect no matter what. Snake Tongue couldn't comment too much on this sort of matter. She only acted in the proper manner and said, if Milord doesn't mind this sinner's humble dwelling, it would be good for her to temporarily move in. Yin Lu didn't think that Luonan would go live in a residential area with many eyes and ears. She just responded politely, I will mention it to Mr. Well, if Luonan hadn't found a suitable replacement yacht by the time he returned. Speaking of which, didn't he spend too much time at the bottom of the lake? Mobile version, M.